Hi, it's Lynne here, and we're already on week 3 of Sarah Hatton's A Day Out blanket. And this week the square is called Hob Hey Lane, which is a lovely name, isn't it? Now, the square is created, the pattern on the square, is created by slipping stitches, a little similar to the mosaic knitting last week, but slightly different. And when you slip the stitches on this pattern, you purl a stitch, then the yarn is already at the front of your work, and then you just slip the next stitch and then knit the next stitch. And what that does, it creates these little elongated bits of yarn on the right side of your work, and this is what's creating this lovely defined diamond shaped pattern. Now, when Sara and Sarah were having a chat on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, they did explain that every week the pattern instructions are written out in full and also are presented in the way of a chart. So we thought it might help to, for those of you who might be quite new to knitting, if you haven't read many charts before, to help you understand how to read a chart and what everything means, then it might be helpful for me to do a little video for you, which is what we're doing now. So when you get a chart in a knitting pattern, usually what the chart represents is that each square of the grid on the chart, so each one of these little squares represents one of your knitted stitches. So for example, on this chart, if we just look along the bottom of the chart, it starts at number 1 on the right hand side and it finishes at number 37 on the left hand side. And so if you look at the pattern instructions, it tells you to cast on 37 stitches. So therefore you can see then that each one of these squares represents 1 stitch of your knitting. Okay. Now also you might have noticed already that even though our knitted square is square, the chart itself is more of a rectangle, and that's because a knitted stitch isn't quite square, so the stitch is usually a little bit wider than it is long, and therefore you need more length to get the same width of knitting. So if you cast on 37 stitches and you only knitted 37 rows, you will probably end up with your square sort of looking a bit about that sort of shape, so it wouldn't be an actual square. And so that all relates to the tension as to how many rows you actually need to knit, but that's why we have more rows than we do stitches, because of the knitting tension. Okay, so that's one aspect of the graph, or the chart, sorry. And usually with a chart, the point that you start reading the chart is the bottom right hand corner, and that's where both numbers say 1. So this is the first square, sort of here where I've got my pencil. Okay, so if you didn't read the written instructions, what you would do is start looking at the chart key, and what the key tells you is what each one of these squares actually means. So if there's a symbol inside a square, it should tell you in the key what you're supposed to do with that stitch. So if we look at these empty boxes, so the empty squares on the chart, we can see here on the key is the empty square, and what that's telling us is that on the right side of your knitting, so when you're knitting an odd numbered row, this is going to be the right side of your knitting because that's the first row. So when you start reading across from right to left on the first row, all of these squares are empty, so we're going to knit every single one of those stitches. And then we get to the end, then we turn round and we start the next row, which is row 2, and we start reading from left to right. And again, these squares are all empty, so we're going to purl those stitches, because here the key tells us on the wrong side we purl the empty squares. So we've done a knit row, we've done a purl row, and then we're back to the right side of our knitting. So row number 3 is also a knit row, and row number 4 is a purl row. So basically we've got 4 rows of stocking stitch there. And if you look at the written instructions, it tells you row 1 to knit, row 2 and all wrong side rows purl, and then row 3 is knit. So that matches up with the chart so far. Now it does help when you're reading a chart, if you've got a little ruler or even some washi tape that you can stick onto your pattern, it really helps to just put that ruler or some tape or fold the pattern under, whatever you want to do, so that you know that where your ruler is, this is the line that you want to read across the chart. So we're on row 5. It's an odd numbered row and it's a right side row. And now we're starting to see these symbols appear on this line. So what we want to know is what do they mean. So if you want to read the chart instead of the written instructions, you just have to go along square by square and making sure that you check the key so that you know what to do. So I'll take the ruler off because it's covering up the key a little bit. So for row 5, we start with an empty square, so we knit 1. Then we've got a square with a little dot, so we're on the right side, and that's telling us to purl. So we've got a knit 1, a purl 1. Then we've got this symbol which is like a little V with a dot in, and that's telling us to slip 1 purlwise with yarn at front. So your yarn is already at the front, so you're just going to slip the next stitch purlwise. And then we come along and we've got another dot in the next square, which is a purl stitch. So far we've knit 1, purl 1, we've slipped 1, and then we've purled another 1. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty squares. So that's knit 5. Okay, empty squares on the right side are all knit. So then we reach the dot stitch, which is a purl stitch. So we purl 1, we slip the next stitch purlwise with yarn at front, and we purl another 1, and then we knit 5, and we do that all the way along. And we get to the end. After the last purl stitch, we're only knitting 1 stitch, and then we get to the next row, which is row 6, and we read that all the way back along. And it's an empty box for each stitch, so we purl all of those stitches on that wrong side row. And it's just as simple as that, really. You know, if you've got your ruler, pop it underneath. We're starting here with an odd numbered row, so we read that row from right to left, and we just read each square as you come to it. So for row 7, we'll go through it one more time. We have 2 empty squares, so that's knit 2, purl 1, slip 1 with yarn at front, purl 1, and then we knit 3, purl 1, slip 1, purl 1, slip 1, purl 1, knit 3. And so you can start to see when you look at a graph that the graph itself should look like the pattern is going to look when you've knitted it. So if we look at this, we've got the diamond in the middle, which we can see here on our square, and then above and below the diamond we've got these zigzags going up and down, which are created by those slipped stitches. And if you look at your knitting, you can see those 2 there. And so your knitted square should look just like the chart square. And then you just keep moving your ruler up as you've done each one, each row. You can move your ruler up and just go on like that. And if there's anything, you know, that you struggle with, you've still got the written instructions, so you can always check against that as well. But sometimes it's easier to read off a chart than it is to read the instructions, because visually you can see what you're doing with a chart, and sometimes, you know, written instructions you can lose your place quite easily, or, you know, you might just want to glance over. But it's one of those things really where it's just entirely up to you as to what you prefer. But hopefully you could give this one a go, because it is quite straightforward. Instead of reading the written instructions, just maybe try following the chart and seeing how you get on, and just, you know, get yourself familiar and confident then with working from a chart. Now I just wanted to show you quickly how to do the slip stitch, just in case you're not quite sure. So I've got my knitting here and I'm at row 45. And so reading the chart, as we've already chatted about, we're going to look at the first stitch, that's a knit stitch, then we've got a purl stitch, and then we've got the slipped stitch, followed by another purl stitch. So if I do that little bit of the pattern, we're going to knit one, then the next square tells me to purl, and then the next square tells me to slip one purlwise with yarn at front. So the yarn's already at the front, you don't need to put it anywhere else. Slip the stitch as if you're going to purl it, and then you're going to purl the next stitch. And what that's done is it's left a little strand of yarn in front of the stitch that's in the middle of those two purl stitches, and that's what's helping to create the very defined pattern. Now the pattern tells us, the chart, sorry, tells us to knit 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're back to that little set of purl stitches. So we're going to purl one stitch, we're going to slip the next stitch purlwise, leaving our yarn at the front, and then we're going to purl the next stitch. And that's how you do those little clusters of purl stitches with the slip stitch in the middle. It's as simple as that. So I do hope you really enjoyed this lovely pattern, and if you get stuck with reading the chart, just rewind and watch the video again, and hopefully it will help you. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.